Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we are going to talk about Zucken. Zucken is a technique that's supposed to be sort of the opposite of a Dirtwechsel. If you don't know, Zucken basically translates to pulling, and it's supposed to represent the intent to pull your blade up in order to create a new opening and then attack a different opening. Whereas Dirtwechsel is all about dipping your point or your sword low to create a new opening or attack a new opening. So we'll watch this exchange real quick. And there's the Zucken. And specifically, the Zucken part is right here. These two people are in a bind, but nobody really has a strong or a weak position. This person's vaguely starting to wind up a little bit, but they're so far down, tip to tip, that wind's not really going to do anything. But what this does is it applies pressure to the blade. And as is very common with people, is that when you put a little bit of pressure on their blade, they're going to put a little pressure back to try to maintain that even keel. They want to match your strength in that bind so that they don't get pushed out of the way. But what this does is it opens them up to simply pulling the sword off of the bind. And you see the second that happens, very briefly, this person's sword goes off to their left. And it creates an opening. And when you follow it up, what that means is that just like when you're feinting at somebody, like you throw a right Oberhau and then you change it to a left Oberhau, what you're looking for is that overcommitment to a parry that won't work. And Zucken sort of creates that situation in a different manner. Rather than attacking something and then, pulling that attack and waiting for them to throw a defense over there, what you're doing is you're taking advantage of the fact that they're putting that positive pressure on the blade so that when you then suddenly release the pressure, they can't help but push their blade 2, 3, 4 inches off to the wrong side because it takes the body and the brain that amount of time to suddenly stop putting pressure where now there's nothing to resist it. And in that gap, it's pretty easy to come back around and attack the new opening that happened. In this case, the blade of this person went off a couple inches to the left. They made a little pivot step also to their left. And what that meant is that this attack coming to their right side, they had to move their hands quite a bit and rotate quite a bit in order to get there. And that crucial, half a second spent pushing over to the left when they could have simply stayed right where they were, it basically doubled the amount of time it took for them to move from the position where they were to guard the position that they were being attacked in. And as a result, this person got a free little hand shot. It looks very simple when you watch it happen, but it is very effective. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about is how this differs and how this is used differently than Dirtwechsel. So technically speaking, I think according to the text, you could theoretically use Dirtwechsel in the same way. If you go all the way back to the beginning of this where the people are just kind of bound up at a distance, theoretically, you could Dirtwechsel here. You could dip your tip and the exact same thing would happen. They'd be pushing a little bit too hard. Suddenly the pressure would be gone. They'd push their sword a little bit too far off to one side. You could dip your tip back up and stab them or cut them, whatever. The reason that you use Dirtwechsel or Zucken, depending on the situation, I think has a lot to do with the biomechanics of the fact that all cuts and all pressure comes from the shoulders. And it's specifically why I think Zucken is much better when the bind is already there, whereas Dirtwechsel is much better if the bind is coming. So a classic play that exists in this is a Zorn. And a Zornhau specifically, you could define as when somebody is trying to cut your sword, specifically your sword and not you, as a method of getting it offline, getting it out of position, and then opening up, a counterattack. Whenever someone swings at your sword, you have to get it out of the way to make them miss. The problem is that if you pull your sword up, you're keeping your sword in the line of the Zorn, and you have to pull your sword very, very far up in order to get it out of the line of fire of that Zorn coming at it. Whereas with a Dirtwechsel, you can dip it down only 2, 3, 4 inches, and they're going to miss. Whereas in a bind, the opposite is true. in a bind like this person would have to dip their sword pretty low in order to get it underneath the level of their hands. And that's because right now the bind is going up at a 45-degree angle. You have to make up for all that distance with your Dirtschwechsel because the bind is high, and in order to go under it, you have to go that much further beneath. Pulling, on the other hand, Zuckening right up is very short. You're at the end of the sword in both of these cases. There's maybe only 3-4 inches left of the sword in general. Pull that sword up just that 3 inches, and suddenly they have no pressure. And no matter how far they try to chase you by maybe extending their blade forward, they're not going to be able to keep up with that in time. Whereas with the Dirtschwechsel, because their hands are low and their blade is high, they can theoretically try to match you by lowering their own blade, and again, increase the amount of distance you have to travel with that Dirtschwechsel. So the short answer here is that if someone is binding with you like this, a Zucken is a great solution to that problem. But if someone is sitting back and they're not binding with you and you think they're going to bind with you, then the Dirtschwechsel is the right solution. That's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.